Death on the Midnight Steamboat, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Chapter 1. The River That Keeps Its Secrets. The SS Celestine was a vessel that had grown old gracefully, the way certain aristocratic women do, with a kind of dignified shabbiness that only added to her charm. Her brass fittings gleamed from daily polishing. Her mahogany panels carried the warm glow of teak oil applied by devoted hands, and her 3 decks rose above the Thames with the self-possession of a dowager duchess presiding over an unruly family reunion. She had been built in 1899 for a shipping magnate who believed that travel along England's rivers ought to be conducted with the same ceremony as travel through life itself, slowly, deliberately, and with adequate provision for dinner. It was the 14th of September when the Celestine departed Charing Cross Pier on her 3-day journey upriver toward Oxford, carrying with her a passenger manifest that Captain Aldous Frew had privately described to his first mate as a collection of individuals one would not ordinarily place in the same room. He had been more right than he knew. Arthur Bellingham had chartered the steamboat for the occasion. He was 63 years old, broad across the shoulders, in the manner of a man who had once been physically powerful and now carried his former strength as comfortable surplus weight. His face was red and decisive, his white moustache was waxed to fierce symmetry, and he wore his wealth the way he wore his jackets, visibly and without apology. Bellingham had made his fortune in pharmaceutical manufacturing, a fact that was printed in every newspaper profile written about him and omitted from every conversation he initiated himself. He preferred, when asked, to describe himself simply as a man who solved problems. The occasion for the charter was, ostensibly, the celebration of Bellingham's 40th year in business. The guest list, however, suggested a gathering somewhat more complex than a simple anniversary party. His niece, Constance Bellingham, occupied a first-class cabin on the upper deck. She was 31, possessed of a composed, fine-featured beauty that several portrait painters had attempted to capture, and none had quite succeeded. She managed her uncle's charitable foundation and was understood by those who observed such things closely to be the person who actually made decisions in the Bellingham household, though she was careful never to allow this understanding to become openly acknowledged. She sat in a deck chair that afternoon reading a novel she was not actually reading, her eyes moving at appropriate intervals across pages that failed to register. Beside her, at intervals, appeared her fiancé, Mr. Gerald Ashford. He was 38, lean and dark-haired, with the kind of precise good looks that suggest breeding without confirming it. He was a solicitor in a firm that handled, among other clients, the Bellingham estate. He had a habit of touching his collar when uncertain, and of smiling when he was not amused, and Constance had noticed both habits approximately 6 months into their 18-month engagement without allowing herself to examine what either observation meant. Dr. Harriet Voss was the 3rd passenger of note. She was 54, angular and sharp-eyed, with close-cropped silver hair and the bearing of a woman accustomed to being the most intelligent person present. She had been Bellingham's personal physician for 11 years and had accompanied him on 3 previous river journeys, a fact she mentioned in the course of introductions, with a subtle emphasis that placed her in a category distinct from the other guests. She carried a leather medical bag that never left her immediate vicinity, and drank only water at dinner. Then there was Mr. Sylvester Crane, who had arrived at the pier in a taxi, paid the driver from a clip of notes he counted twice, and come aboard with 2 large suitcases and the watchful expression of a man who had learned not to assume that any situation would develop to his advantage. He was 45, florid, with thinning auburn hair and the ruined good looks of someone who had once been charming and was now working considerably harder at it. He had been introduced to the other guests as Bellingham's business partner, though Arthur Bellingham had introduced him with a pause before the word partner that was barely perceptible and yet somehow unmistakable. The 6th member of the assembled party was Miss Edith Quarry, Bellingham's personal secretary, a woman of 51 who had served him for 17 years and whose inner life remained entirely unknown to every person aboard the vessel. She was thin, efficient, perpetually attentive, and she possessed the gift, invaluable in her profession, of being present without appearing to occupy space. They had gathered for cocktails at 6 o'clock in the upper saloon, where the September light fell golden through tall windows, and the Thames moved quietly past with the disinterested patience of something very old. The conversation was careful, and the laughter came slightly too quickly at all the wrong moments. Captain Frew had joined them briefly, a compact man of 60, with the weathered competence that rivers demand of those who spend their lives on them. He had welcomed the guests, outlined the itinerary with brisk professionalism, and excused himself with the air of a man who preferred the engine-room to any saloon. The Celestine had slipped her moorings at 6:30, and by the time the first dinner was laid, 5 courses, properly served by the steward, a quiet young man named Thomas Wick, the vessel had moved far enough from the city that the banks on either side had turned from stone and commerce to willow trees and silence. It was during this dinner that certain things were observed by those who observed things. Bellingham and Crane sat at opposite ends of the oval table and addressed each other with elaborate, exhausting cordiality. Constance watched her uncle with an attention that she disguised as general sociability. Gerald Ashford watched Constance. Dr. Voss watched everyone with the professional detachment of someone accustomed to reading bodies for signs of dysfunction. Edith Quarry ate her sole meunière with a precision that suggested she was not tasting it. After dinner, Bellingham had remained behind when the others drifted toward the observation deck or their cabins. He had called Edith Quarry back and spoken to her in a low, rapid voice for approximately 4 minutes. Those passing the saloon doorway caught only fragments, the words "document," "morning," and, unmistakably, "not yet." The Celestine moved on through the darkening evening. By 10 o'clock, the river had turned black, and the stars were sharp and indifferent overhead. One by one, the lights in the cabins went out. At midnight, Arthur Bellingham was dead. Chapter 2. The Body Beneath the Lantern. It was Thomas Wick who found him. The steward had risen at 11:30 to secure a porthole in the lower galley that had been rattling against its latch for the better part of an hour. A small sound, the kind that disappears when one makes the decision to investigate and returns the moment one returns to bed. He had padded down the narrow service corridor in his socks, attended to the porthole, and was returning toward his cabin when he noticed that the light in the forward observation room was still burning. This, in itself, was not extraordinary. Passengers on river journeys sometimes found that movement and dark water produced a kind of reflective sleeplessness, but the forward observation room was at the bow of the upper deck, separated from the cabins by a stretch of open deck, and the cold had come in off the water during the evening in that definitive September way that announces summer's capitulation. No one, Thomas thought, would choose to sit out the midnight hour in that exposed room without a compelling reason. He opened the door. Arthur Bellingham sat in the largest of the wicker chairs arranged before the forward windows. His body settled into it with a terrible stillness that Thomas recognized, in the way one recognizes certain things without prior experience, as the stillness of death. His head had fallen back at an angle. His right hand rested on the arm of the chair, with the fingers loosely curled, as though he had released something in his last moment. His left hand lay in his lap. His face, what Thomas could see of it in the amber light of the single lantern mounted above the forward windows, was slack and faintly bluish around the lips. On the small table beside the chair stood a glass containing approximately 2 inches of brandy. A second glass, empty and clean, stood beside it. Thomas Wick did not touch anything. He had sufficient wit and sufficient control of his nerves to back carefully out of the observation room, pull the door closed behind him, and proceed directly to the captain's cabin. Captain Frew dressed in 4 minutes and was in the observation room in 5. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, then turned back and spoke to Thomas in a very quiet, very level voice. "Wake Dr. Voss, no one else, and Thomas, do not say anything to anyone until I tell you that you may." Dr. Harriet Voss arrived within minutes, wearing a heavy dressing gown and carrying her medical bag. She examined Bellingham with unhurried thoroughness, checking his pulse at the wrist and throat, examining his lips and eyes and fingernails, carefully noting the position of the body, and finally, and with particular attention, lifting the brandy glass to her nose without touching its rim. "He has been dead between 1 and 2 hours, she said, straightening. "I cannot determine cause of death definitively without a proper examination, but there are indications that concern me greatly." She paused. "The cyanosis around the mouth, the fixed expression, and this," she indicated the brandy glass. "There is an odour I cannot be entirely certain of in such a dilute state, but which I do not find consistent with brandy alone." Captain Frew looked at her steadily. "Are you saying what I believe you are saying?" "I am saying," Dr. Voss replied, with the precision of someone who chose words as a surgeon chooses instruments, "that I would strongly recommend this vessel alter course immediately to the nearest pier with police access, that this room be locked and the key retained by you personally, and that none of the passengers leave the boat until they have been spoken to by the appropriate authorities." "And the second glass?" Dr. Voss looked at it again. "Washed. Recently. The rim still carries a faint moisture." The captain reached the nearest pier, a small commercial landing at Culverham, by 1:30 in the morning. By 3 o'clock, the Thames Valley Constabulary had sent Inspector Harold Good, a solid, sensible man who proceeded methodically and without imagination. By 7 in the morning, Inspector Good had interviewed each of the 5 remaining passengers in the cramped dining saloon, established that all 5 claimed to have been in their respective cabins from approximately 10 o'clock onward, and found himself in possession of 5 alibis that confirmed each other in no meaningful way whatsoever. By 8 o'clock, someone had sent a telegram. By 10 o'clock, a hired motor car had arrived at the Culverham landing stage, and from it emerged, with deliberate unhurried dignity, a small egg-shaped man in a beautifully pressed grey suit, with a magnificent moustache, small patent leather shoes, and a pair of eyes of extraordinary intelligence. Hercule Poirot stepped aboard the SS Celestine and regarded the river with mild interest for precisely 30 seconds before turning his attention to the matter at hand. Chapter 3. The Belgian Considers. The River Inspector Good had not requested Hercule Poirot. He had made this clear to the constable who delivered the message of Poirot's arrival, to the sergeant who came to inform him that a small foreign gentleman was asking very politely to be admitted, and, with somewhat less force, to Poirot himself when the detective appeared at the dining saloon door, with his hat in his hands, and an expression of the most courteous inquiry. "I do not wish to impose upon your investigation, Inspector," Poirot said, settling into a chair with a care for the creases in his trousers that Good found mildly infuriating. "I am here because I received a communication this morning from Mademoiselle Constance Bellingham, who is an acquaintance of a friend of mine. She asks only that I make myself available. Whether you find my availability useful is of course entirely for you to determine." Good studied him. Poirot returned the study with pleasant attentiveness, the way a cat watches something that does not yet interest it sufficiently to pounce. "I've heard of you," Good said finally. "Most people have," Poirot agreed. Without either pride or modesty, the inspector showed him the observation room, which had been locked as Dr. Voss had recommended, and which now bore the distinct atmosphere of a place where careful official attention had been paid. The body had been removed, transported to the county mortuary by the time Poirot arrived, but the chair, the table, the 2 glasses and the brandy decanter remained exactly as Dr. Voss had found them, with the single addition of identifying labels. Poirot stood in the centre of the room for a very long time without speaking. He did not immediately examine the glasses or the chair. He looked at the windows. He looked at the door through which Thomas Wick had entered. He looked at the ceiling and at the lantern. He turned slowly and examined the room from each of its four corners. He crouched, with some care, and examined the floor. He rose, smoothed his trousers, and then, only then, bent to examine the two glasses without touching them. "The second glass," he said. "It has been processed by your people?" "Fingerprints attempted," Good said. "Nothing usable. Recently wiped." "Wiped," Poirot repeated, making of the word something slightly different from what Good had intended. Not merely rinsed, wiped. He moved to the windows and looked forward along the bow. The body was in this chair, the head in this position. He tilted his head back at a slight angle, replicating, Good realized, the exact angle he must have seen in the crime scene photographs. He sat here not to observe the river, but because this chair, of all the chairs in this room, faces away from the door. To approach a man seated here, one need not pass through his field of vision. He knew his killer, Good said. Perhaps. Or his killer was sufficiently familiar with this room to have selected it for precisely that reason. Poirot straightened. The decanter. It has been tested. Being tested now. Dr. Voss's suspicion is that it's aconitine. We'll have confirmation within 24 hours. Poirot nodded slowly. Aconitine. Yes. The symptoms as described to me would be consistent. A tasteless poison in sufficient quantity, producing cardiac arrest that an incautious initial examination might attribute to natural causes. Had the good doctor not possessed both a sharp nose and considerable professional integrity, this might very well have been recorded as the death of an elderly man from heart failure. He paused. How fortunate that Dr. Voss was present. He said it quite neutrally, but Good felt the observation settle in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Over the following hour, Poirot walked every corridor of the SS Celestine with a slow, systematic attention that Thomas Wick, who accompanied him at Good's instruction, found both impressive and vaguely unnerving. Poirot said almost nothing during this survey. He paused at the entrance to each cabin, reading the nameplates. He examined the lock of the service corridor. He stood for 3 full minutes at the rail of the upper deck looking down at the river. The vessel cannot move, he said to Thomas. No, sir. Police's instructions. We're moored here until they're satisfied. And the passengers, they remain aboard. Yes, sir, though they're not happy about it. Poirot turned from the rail with a small smile. No, I imagine they are not. And yet the river, she is very patient. She will wait for all of us eventually. He appeared to find this thought congenial rather than morbid. Now, Thomas, you will tell me everything you observed last evening, from the moment the first passenger came aboard until the moment you opened the door of the forward observation room. Everything, you understand. Not only what seemed important. Everything, Thomas Wick told him. It took 40 minutes. When the young man had finished, Poirot sat very still for a moment, looking at the middle distance with his head tilted slightly to the left, a posture Thomas would later describe that suggested a man listening to a piece of music being played in another room. The second glass, Poirot said at last. When you laid out the observation room yesterday evening, before departure, how many glasses did you place? Thomas blinked. 1, sir. Mr. Bellingham always took a single nightcap before retiring. Always the same. A measure of brandy in the large bowl glass. He'd specifically told me, first day of a river journey, only the 1 glass and the decanter. And you did not place a second glass? No, sir, definitely not. Poirot nodded, and in his eyes there appeared an expression that was not quite satisfaction, but was perhaps its first cousin, the expression of a man who has heard, in that music from the other room, the first clear notes of a recognizable melody. Chapter 4. 5 versions of an evening. The interviews took place in the dining saloon, at the oval table where they had all sat for dinner the previous evening. Poirot had asked Inspector Good, with the most delicate tact, whether he might conduct these conversations himself. or rather, whether good might conduct them while Poirot listened. The inspector, who had formed a cautious respect for the Belgian during their hour together, and who had, besides, not yet found a thread worth pulling in any of the 5 accounts already taken, agreed. Constance Bellingham came first. She was composed in the manner of someone who has decided, before entering the room, to be composed, and who is doing so by considerable act of will. Her hands were still in her lap. Her eyes were direct and clear, though reddened at the rims. "You were fond of your uncle," Poirot said, not as a question. "Very," she said. A pause. He could be a difficult man. He usually was. But he was also consistent. I knew where I stood with him. "And where did you stand?" She met his gaze. He was going to change his will. "I believe you should know that straight away, since someone will tell you eventually, and I would rather it came from me. He told me 3 weeks ago that he was reconsidering the distribution of his estate. He did not tell me in what direction. Did this alarm you? It clarified certain things." She stopped. "That is not an answer, is it?" "Yes, I was concerned. My work with the foundation depends on the foundation continuing to be funded. It is not a personal fortune I was protecting. It is the work." Poirot asked her about the previous evening. She had retired at 10:30, she said. She had read for perhaps 30 minutes and then slept. She had heard nothing unusual. "You did not visit the forward observation room?" "No, not at any point during the evening." A fractional hesitation. "No." Poirot thanked her with great warmth and asked her to send in Mr. Ashford. Gerald Ashford entered with the studied calm of a man trained in professional discretion and sat with his hands on the table, loosely clasped. He had a solicitor's habit of listening to questions with great attention before answering them, a habit that in the context of a murder investigation, Poirot reflected, was either reassuring or the reverse. He confirmed Constance's account of the dinner. He had retired at approximately 10:15, he said. He had a habit of reading legal documents in the evening, he indicated a briefcase, and had done so until midnight, at which point he had slept. "Legal documents," Poirot said pleasantly. "For Mr. Bellingham, for the firm generally, not pertaining to Mr. Bellingham's estate. I am not at liberty to discuss the specifics of any client's affairs." "No," Poirot agreed. "But I wonder, Mr. Ashford, when a solicitor is invited on a private river journey by his most significant client, and that client has recently indicated an intention to alter his will, and that client is then found dead, one wonders whether the legal documents carried on such a journey might not be entirely unrelated to the matter." Ashford's hands tightened almost imperceptibly. "I can tell you that Mr. Bellingham contacted my firm 2 weeks ago regarding certain changes he wished to make. A meeting had been scheduled on our return to London. Nothing had been signed. And, in the absence of any signed document, the existing will stands?" "That is correct. And the existing will benefits." The pause lasted exactly 1 second longer than professional discretion required. "Miss Constance Bellingham is the primary beneficiary. Mr. Crane receives a specified percentage of the business assets. Miss Quarry receives a defined bequest." Poirot thanked him and watched him leave. Dr. Harriet Voss was precise and detailed and volunteered information in an orderly manner that Poirot found both admirable and interesting. She had retired at 10, she said. She had checked her medical bag, a nightly habit, and gone to sleep. She had been asleep when Captain Frew summoned her. "You did not know that Mr. Bellingham intended to alter his will?" "He had mentioned it generally. We spoke sometimes of personal matters. He was not a man who confided easily, but 11 years creates a kind of accumulated candour. And in these candid moments, did he indicate who might benefit or suffer by the change?" A pause. He had become concerned about Mr. Crane, professionally concerned. He felt that certain business decisions had been made without his full knowledge. She stopped. "I am telling you this because I believe it is relevant, not because I wish to direct suspicion toward any individual." "Naturally," Poirot said. "And the aconitine, Doctor, It is a substance you would be familiar with. Every physician of my generation is familiar with it. It has historical therapeutic applications in very small doses. It is also, she said evenly, meeting his eyes, easily obtainable by anyone who knows where to look, not only by medical professionals. I know that because it is true, not because I am defending myself. But of course, Poirot said, smiling. Sylvester Crane came in last among the main passengers, and Poirot noted that he had dressed with particular care, his suit freshly pressed, his hair smoothed back, his manner arranged into something approaching confidence, the way a man arranges furniture to conceal a damaged wall. He had retired early, he said, before 10. He had not felt well. Unwell in what manner? Stomach. Nothing significant. The river movement, possibly. You are not accustomed to river travel. I prefer dry land. Then why accept this invitation? Crane's eyes moved to the window. One does not easily decline Arthur Bellingham's invitations, even when the relationship between you had become strained. The word landed. Crane looked at him sharply. Who told you that? No one told me anything specific. But a man who counts his notes twice before a journey and watches his host with the expression of one calculating a debt is not a man at ease in his company. Tell me about the business. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then, Arthur believed I had moved funds without authorization. He was wrong. I had moved them with what I understood to be tacit approval, based on previous conversations. He chose in recent months to reinterpret those conversations. And the stakes. If his version of events was accepted by a court, I would lose my share of the business and face potential prosecution. A considerable motive, Poirot observed pleasantly. A considerable motive for wanting him alive and in a reasonable mood, Crane said, with an edge of real anger. The man dead is catastrophic for me. Whoever inherits controls the board. The dead cannot be reasoned with. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if something had been confirmed. Chapter 5. The Handkerchief and the Habit. The next morning brought a pale, watery sun that turned the river to hammered silver and made the willows on the bank look theatrical. Poirot rose at 7, dressed with customary precision, and consumed, with visible dissatisfaction, the tisane that Thomas Wick had managed to prepare for him after a patient explanation of its requirements. He then walked, alone, to the forward observation room. The door had been unlocked at his request. He stood in the centre of the room again, as he had the previous day, and let the morning light do what the lantern light had not, reveal the texture of surfaces. He looked at the wicker chair from every angle. He crouched again and examined the floor beside the small table. There, half under the curve of the table's base, was something he had noted but not yet retrieved yesterday, a small white rectangle, partly obscured by the table's shadow. He had deliberately left it, wishing to see it again in better light before disturbing it. It was a handkerchief, fine linen, edged with a narrow border of pale blue. He did not touch it directly, but bent to examine it closely. It was folded, not crumpled, folded in a precise rectangle, as if returned to a pocket after use. It had fallen, or been placed, in a position that suggested it had come from the table above rather than the chair beside. On one corner of the handkerchief, worked in pale blue thread matching the border, were initials, EQ. Poirot straightened slowly. He went next to Edith Quarry's cabin. She answered his knock in a dress that looked as if she had been wearing it for hours, her hair pinned with the automatic precision of long habit, her eyes showing the particular flatness of someone who has been through a shock and has not yet found the other side of it. He asked her, gently, about the handkerchief. She was very still for a moment. Then, "I was there," she said. "Last night, I went to him at about 9:30, before I retired. You did not mention this to Inspector Good." "No." A pause. "I know how it looks. Tell me how it was." She sat down on the narrow cabin bed, folding her hands in her lap in a gesture that was almost identical to the way Constance Bellingham had sat. The gesture, Poirot thought, of women who have learned to be composed under the gaze of men who hold authority. "I had worked for Arthur Bellingham for 17 years, she said. I knew his moods, I knew his habits, and I knew, when he spoke to me after dinner, that he was frightened. Not anxious, frightened. Arthur Bellingham was not a man who frightened easily, and I had only seen it in him twice before, once during a business crisis in 1931, and once when his wife died. He had that same quality in his face, as though the ground had shifted. What did he say to you? He said he needed me to witness a document in the morning, before we docked at Henley. He said," she stopped, "he said he wanted to be certain that there was time to make it official before anyone could prevent it. And this document, he described its nature. He said it was a codicil to his existing will, handwritten. He had written it in his cabin that evening after dinner. He showed it to me. I didn't read it in detail, but I saw that it removed Mr. Crane from the business arrangement entirely and redirected those assets. He sealed it in an envelope and put it in the inside pocket of his evening jacket. Poirot was very still, and when you went to him in the observation room, he was alive and in good spirits, almost, relieved, as if the decision had cost him something, and he was glad to have it made. I stayed perhaps 20 minutes. We talked about the river. Her voice caught slightly on the last word. Just the river. He always loved this journey. We talked about nothing of consequence. I left at approximately 10 minutes before 10, and he was perfectly well. The brandy, he offered you a glass. He poured one for me from the decanter. I set it down on the table after a sip or two. I don't care for brandy particularly. He topped up his own glass as I left. She paused. There was only one glass set out when I arrived. I took it. He used the decanter cap as a temporary measure, then asked Thomas. No, he didn't ask Thomas. He poured for himself from the decanter. Directly. Poirot looked at her steadily. And the envelope? In his jacket pocket. When the body was found, she met his eyes. I don't know. I imagine Inspector Good would have noted if it was there. Inspector Good, Poirot said carefully, noted no envelope. The silence that followed was complete, except for the small sounds of the moored boat, water against the hull, rope against wood, the patient language of rivers. Chapter 6. The Map of Small Untruths. Poirot asked Captain Frew to produce the vessel's internal log. Every river steamboat of any serious operation maintained such a document, a record kept by the duty crew of any significant event during each watch. Engine checks, weather observations, passenger incidents, requests and complaints. It was not a formal document in the legal sense, but it was maintained with the rigour of professional habit, and Captain Frew was a man of professional habit. The log for the previous evening made for careful reading. At 21:14, Thomas Wick had noted a request from Cabin 3 for additional towels. Cabin 3 was Gerald Ashford's. At 21:38, the duty engineer had noted a brief temperature drop in the forward boiler and its subsequent correction, a technical notation of no apparent significance. At 21:55, Thomas Wick had noted that the upper deck lights had been dimmed per standard procedure. At 22:03, he had noted that all cabin lights visible from the service corridor appeared to be extinguished, with the exception of Cabin 1, Bellingham, and the forward observation room. At 22:47, nearly an hour after Thomas believed all passengers had retired, the log recorded, "Heard movement on upper deck aft passageway, assumed passenger using the facilities, no action taken." Poirot read this entry 3 times. Then he summoned the duty engineer, a quiet man named Parks, and asked him about the boiler temperature drop at 21:38. "Minor thing," Parks said. "Happens sometimes when a porthole above the forward ventilation intake is opened. Creates a change in the airflow. Not a mechanical issue, environmental. And which porthole would correspond to this intake? "The one in cabin 2, sir. Forward upper deck. That's Miss Constance's cabin." Poirot thanked him. He went to Constance Bellingham's cabin and knocked. She opened the door at once, as if she had been near it. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said pleasantly, "I wonder if I might look at your porthole." She stepped aside. The porthole in the forward wall of the cabin was closed and latched, but on the latch handle, Poirot observed, was a slight compression mark on the inner edge, the kind left by a hand gripping a surface and releasing it with some haste. More significantly, on the outer sill, visible when one leaned close to the porthole glass, was a dark smear, river mud, the specific, silty, grey-green variety particular to the Thames. He turned to Constance. "You went outside," he said. "Not an accusation, simply a statement of observed fact." She did not respond immediately. Then, "The deck," she said. "I went onto the deck, through the cabin door, not the porthole, obviously." She smiled, very slightly. "I needed air. The dinner had been difficult. My uncle was. The atmosphere between him and Gerald, between him and Mr. Crane, it was suffocating. I went out for perhaps 15 minutes, between 9:30 and 9:45, and while you were on deck, I walked toward the stern. I leaned over the rail for a while. I came back. Did you pass the forward observation room?" A pause. "No. I went aft." "You did not enter the forward observation room?" "No." Poirot looked at the river mud on the outer sill. The observation room's forward windows, he had noticed, were positioned such that their outer sills were connected to the bow rail, reachable, at a stretch, from the deck outside, particularly if one was leaning outward. He said nothing about this. He thanked her and left. He found Gerald Ashford at the stern rail and stood beside him for a moment, watching the mooring rope's reflection shift in the dark water. "The document case," Poirot said, "the one you brought aboard. It contains, among other things, the new codicil that Mr. Bellingham asked your firm to prepare." Ashford turned his head sharply. "I don't know what you—" "He contacted your firm 2 weeks ago. He described what he wished to do. Your firm prepared a formal document. He asked you to bring it on this journey, so that it could be signed and witnessed with appropriate legal formality, perhaps with Mademoiselle Constance and Miss Quarry as witnesses." Poirot paused. He had also prepared his own handwritten version as a precaution in case the formal document was delayed. The silence between them was articulate. "He told you," Ashford said. "Miss Quarry told me. And the formal codicil, it is in your document case." Ashford said nothing for a very long moment, then, "Yes. And it removes Mr. Crane entirely from the business, correct? It redirects his share to a charitable trust." "Yes." "And your relationship with Mr. Bellingham's estate, your firm's relationship, becomes considerably more significant after such a change. A new charitable trust requires administration, legal administration." Poirot looked at him mildly. "You are not a suspect, Mr. Ashford, in the sense that your interests lay in Mr. Bellingham's survival, but you have withheld information. I was following professional obligations." "You were following professional obligations in a direction that happened to serve your interests," Poirot said, not unkindly. "These are not always the same thing, though they sometimes appear so." He walked back toward the bow, leaving Ashford at the rail. Chapter 7. The Wait of 11 Years. It was the river that gave Poirot his longest thinking hour. He had taken up a position in the lower saloon, where a window ran the full length of the starboard wall, and the moored willows leaned toward their own reflections with hypnotic patience. He had ordered, again through the long-suffering Thomas, a cup of hot water with a slice of lemon, which was not quite what he wanted, but was the closest available approximation, and he sat with it untouched before him and arranged the facts. The facts, as he held them in his mind, were these. Arthur Bellingham had been poisoned. The laboratory confirmation had arrived that morning, aconitine in the brandy decanter, sufficient quantity to produce cardiac arrest within 20 to 40 minutes of consumption. He had consumed his last glass of brandy at approximately 10 o'clock, which placed time of death between 10:30 and 11:30. The handwritten codicil had vanished. The formal document in Ashford's briefcase remained, but a handwritten codicil, if it had existed in the evening jacket pocket, was gone. 5 people had been aboard with means of access to the forward observation room. All claimed to have been elsewhere from 10 o'clock onward. Edith Quarry had been in the observation room until approximately 9:50. She had taken the glass, the second glass, her glass, when she left. And yet that glass had been there, clean and dry, when Thomas found the body. The killer had brought a second glass to the observation room, used it, wiped it, and replaced it on the table. Why? This question had occupied Poirot considerably. A second glass on a table, he thought, suggests a second person present. A second person present at the time of the murder, or shortly before it, is what the killer wishes to suggest. Someone shared a drink with Bellingham, and the killer's intention was that this shared drink would point toward that person. But the glass had been placed incorrectly. Edith Quarry had told him she had left at 9:50. She had taken the glass she used. When the body was found, both glasses were present. The killer, who had come after 9:50 and before 11, had brought a fresh glass and placed it on the table, intending to suggest that Edith Quarry had stayed longer than she admitted, that she had been the last person to share a drink with the dead man. The killer had not known that Edith Quarry had taken her glass when she left. They had assumed the glass would still be there, and that placing a second, clean glass beside it would create a false picture. 2 glasses, 1 person's fingerprints, 1 obvious suspect. Instead, because Edith had taken her glass, the killer's planted glass was the only one present, and it pointed, by its very cleanliness, toward the person who had felt the need to wipe it. Poirot turned his lemon water in its cup. Now, the mud on the outer sill of Constance Bellingham's porthole. What did that mean? She said she had gone to the stern deck. The mud was on the forward porthole's outer sill. One did not acquire mud from the forward outer sill while walking to the stern. One acquired it while reaching forward along the bow rail toward the observation room windows. But to what purpose? He reconstructed it. The forward observation room windows, he had noted, could be seen from the bow rail's outer reach. Through those windows, if they were unfogged, one could observe the room's interior without entering it. What might Constance Bellingham have wished to see? Or rather, when had she done so? Before or after her uncle's death? He turned back to the question of means. Aconitine. Dr. Harriet Voss had volunteered with admirable transparency that she carried it, that any physician of her generation might. He had checked, very quietly, the contents of her medical bag, which he had offered him access to without hesitation. He had found a small brown glass vial, labelled in her own handwriting, aconite, not for clinical use, historic specimen. The vial was full. If she had used it, she had not used this vial. But a medical bag was not the only source. Aconitine could be extracted, with knowledge and equipment, from monkshood, Aconitum napellus, which grew in English gardens, as it grew in the garden of Bellingham's estate in Berkshire, a fact Poirot had learned from a telephone call placed that morning to Bellingham's housekeeper. All 5 passengers had visited that estate within the past 3 months, the wait of 11 years, Poirot thought. Edith Quarry had worked for Bellingham for 11 years. No, 17. Dr. Voss, 11. In 11 or 17 years, one accumulates knowledge. One also accumulates grievance or loyalty or love, or some compound of all 3 that does not have a simple name. He thought of Edith Quarry's voice when she spoke of Bellingham's fear. He thought of Dr. Voss's composed, careful competence. He thought of Constance Bellingham's phrase, "I knew where I stood with him." A dead man's relationships, he thought, are an archaeology. You dig carefully, and what you find may be very different from what the surface suggests. Chapter 8. The Breaking Point of Sylvester Crane. He found Crane in his cabin at 2 in the afternoon, and the change in the man since the previous day's interview was marked. The careful grooming had slipped, the pressed suit had given way to shirt sleeves and a rumpled jacket. There was a glass on the small cabin desk, not brandy, whiskey, and it had been refilled more than once, though Crane was not, precisely, drunk. He was rather in that advanced state of determined sobriety that requires considerably more effort than actual sobriety and reveals more. "I need to tell you something," Crane said, before Poirot had fully entered the room. "Yes," Poirot said. "I rather thought you might." He sat down in the cabin's single chair and waited, with the patience of a man entirely comfortable with silence. Crane turned the glass in his hands. "I went to see him, last night." "At what time?" "About 10:30, 10:45, perhaps. I'm not certain of the exact time." He looked up. "He was alive when I got there. He was in that chair. He looked at me and he said, I wondered when you'd come, as if he'd been expecting me." "And had he?" "Probably. He knew me well enough, knew I'd have to say something." Crane stood up and moved to the porthole, looking out. "I told him I'd replace the money. All of it. That the decisions I'd made had been wrong. My interpretation of his approval had been wrong, and that I would correct it from my personal assets. I told him I needed 6 months. And his response?" Crane was quiet for a moment. "He laughed," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger and not quite grief. Not a cruel laugh, more tired, as if I'd said something he'd heard before. He said, "Sylvester, I made my decision 3 weeks ago, and I won't unmake it. The lawyers will be in touch when we return." I asked him what he meant. He didn't tell me directly, but he touched his jacket, here. Crane pressed his hand against his own chest, the inside pocket, as if confirming something was there, and he said, "It's already done. He showed you nothing." "No, but I knew what he meant. He'd made some kind of change to the will or the arrangement that closed me out." Crane turned from the porthole. "I left him there. He was alive. The glass was beside him, almost empty. I went back to my cabin. I did not put anything in that glass or in the decanter. I want you to understand that." "I understand what you tell me," Poirot said carefully. "You left him alive. You saw the glass beside him, nearly empty. Was there a second glass on the table?" Crane thought. "No, just the one." "And the time you left? Before 11, possibly 1:45. Did you see anyone in the corridors either going or returning?" Crane hesitated. "Coming back. I thought I heard someone on the upper deck. Movement toward the bow. I didn't look. I wasn't in a state to be curious." Poirot stood. "Thank you, Mr. Crane. Your frankness is more valuable to you than you perhaps realize." He paused at the door. "One further thing. When you entered the observation room, was the window at the forward left open or closed?" Crane blinked at the apparent irrelevance. "Closed." "No. Wait. Slightly. Just an inch or two at the top. I noticed because the curtain was moving." "Thank you," Poirot said again, and left. He went directly to the forward observation room and stood at the forward left window. He examined the top latch mechanism. It could be opened from inside, or, if one were positioned on the bow rail outside and reaching in through a narrow gap, perhaps manipulated from without. He looked at the windowsill's outer edge. There was a trace of river mud there too. Chapter 9. The Final Assembly. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Poirot asked Captain Frew to arrange for all passengers to gather in the upper saloon. He conveyed this request with such pleasant certainty that it seemed unreasonable to question it, and Frew, who had by now developed considerable faith in the Belgian's competence, complied without argument. They filed in at various stages of reluctance. Crane came first, as if resigned to whatever was coming. Dr. Voss arrived with the precise punctuality of someone who considers lateness a form of disrespect. Constance Bellingham entered with Ashford slightly behind her, an arrangement that Poirot noted, and chose a chair near the window. Edith Quarry came last, sat down quietly in the most unobtrusive available seat, and folded her hands. Inspector Good stood near the door, expressly at Poirot's request. Poirot stood at the forward end of the saloon, before the wide windows through which the river moved in the afternoon light. He looked small in that position, small and very still, like the centre of something. He let the silence establish itself. "I will tell you," he said at last, "what happened on this vessel last night. Not what I suspect or what I believe. What happened." He paused, and none of them spoke. Arthur Bellingham came aboard with an intention. He had been afraid, and I use that word deliberately, for some time. He had discovered information that threatened him, not physically. The man was not afraid of physical harm. He was afraid of being made a fool, of having trusted wrong, of having built, over 40 years, something that was being dismantled from within. He looked at Crane. Crane looked back steadily. He had decided to act. He had a handwritten codicil in his inside jacket pocket and a formal version in his solicitor's briefcase, and he intended to sign both documents the following morning, removing certain interests from his estate and redirecting them. He told this to Miss Quarry, who was the only person he trusted without reservation. Edith Quarry's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted, a very small relaxation, as if something she had been holding had been named and could now be put down. Miss Quarry visited him in the forward observation room at approximately 9:30. She left at approximately 9:50, taking with her the glass she had used. At approximately 11:15, Mr. Crane visited him, alive, speaking, composed. He left before 11. In between these two visits, the brandy decanter had been tampered with. "Between 9:50 and 11:15, Good said. "Within that window, yes. Or, and this is important, before either visit. The poison was in the decanter, not the glass. A glass filled from an unpoisoned decanter first, with poison added to the decanter after pouring. That is one method. But it requires the poisoner to be confident that Bellingham would not pour a second glass in Miss Quarry's presence, that the decanter would be used only after she left." He moved slightly, so that the window light fell differently. The forward left window of the observation room was open by approximately 2 inches at the top. From the bow rail outside, a person of moderate height and reach could access this window. They could, carefully, reach the decanter on the small table without entering the room at all. He paused. "The table is positioned here, you see, near the window, within reach." "From outside," Constance said. "From outside," Poirot agreed. He looked at her with something like gentleness. "Your porthole sill, mademoiselle, the river mud, the bow rail's outer edge, near the observation room window, more river mud. You were at the observation room window. From outside. When?" Constance was very still. "When?" Poirot repeated quietly. "Did you first go to that window?" Chapter 10. What the River Carries. The room was absolutely silent. Constance Bellingham looked at Hercule Poirot for a long moment, and he held her gaze with a steadiness that was not unkind, but would not yield. "I went twice," she said at last. The admission moved through the room like a current. The first time was at 9:30. Before Miss Quarry left, I knew she was with him. I went to see if they were still talking. I needed to speak with him myself, and I was waiting. I could see through the glass that they were still in conversation. I came back to my cabin. And the second time, a breath. Just after 10, I had heard Mr. Crane in the corridor. I heard him go toward the observation room. After a few minutes, I went back to the window and watched." She stopped. "I know how that sounds. Tell me what you saw." "Crane was there, arguing with my uncle. Not loudly, but arguing. My uncle was dismissive, calm, the way he was when he'd made a decision, and wouldn't discuss it further. Crane left. I watched him leave through the forward door, and my uncle sat back in his chair. Her hands were tight in her lap now. He reached for his glass. He drank. I watched him. I watched him for perhaps 3 minutes, and then the glass fell. I saw it fall from his hand, and her voice broke cleanly like a branch. I ran back to my cabin, she said when she could. I panicked. I knew that if I reported it, where I had been, what I had been doing, I was at that window twice. It would look as if you had poisoned the decanter from outside, Poirot said. Yes, the word came out very small. And had you? The silence this time was the kind that has physical weight. No, Constance said. I had not. Poirot looked at her for a very long moment. Then he turned to face the rest of the room. She did not, he said. She is telling the truth. And the reason I know this is because of the handwritten codicil. He let the words settle. The codicil that Miss Quarry saw in Mr. Bellingham's inside jacket pocket is gone. The person who took it is the murderer. And the murderer is not Mademoiselle Constance, because the codicil's disappearance tells me something very specific about what the murderer wished to prevent. He looked at the room. The existing will makes Constance Bellingham the primary beneficiary. The codicil did not change that. It removed Crane and redirected his share to charity. Constance had everything to lose if the existing will were altered against her, and everything to gain if it remained as is. She had no reason to take the codicil, he paused, but someone else had every reason to take it, someone whose interests were served neither by the codicil nor by Crane's guilt being established, but by a very specific and different outcome. Good took a step forward. Who? Poirot turned to look at Gerald Ashford. The formal version of the codicil, Poirot said, remains in Mr. Ashford's briefcase. The handwritten version, the one that could have been witnessed and valid immediately, is gone. Without it, there is only the formal version, which has not been signed, and an unsigned document has no legal force. He folded his hands. The existing will stands, but the existing will is administered by Ashford's firm. The new arrangement, a charitable trust, would have required independent trustees, independent counsel. The new arrangement was, in professional terms, extremely inconvenient for Mr. Ashford's firm. Ashford's face had gone very pale. You cannot seriously suggest— I suggest nothing, Poirot said. I observe you were seen, Mr. Ashford, going toward the forward deck at 11 o'clock by Mr. Crane. You requested additional towels at 9:14, a request made, I believe, to establish a reason for Thomas Wick to be in the service corridor, and therefore to note your cabin light as extinguished when it was not. The mud on the bow rail. The window opened from outside. The decanter reached. The glass placed, a glass you obtained from the galley earlier that evening, where an extra glass had been removed from the rack, as Thomas confirmed to me this morning. Ashford rose abruptly. This is the aconitine, Poirot continued, as if Ashford had not moved, came from the estate garden. You visited the estate in August with Mademoiselle Constance. You have a modest knowledge of botany. I observed 3 volumes on the subject in your cabin this morning, through the porthole which you left open. You are not a stupid man, Mr. Ashford. You prepared carefully. You poisoned the decanter through the window, placed a second glass to implicate Miss Quarry, and took the handwritten codicil from the inside pocket of a dead man's jacket when you finally entered the room. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a small evidence bag, which he handed to Inspector Good. Inside it was a key. The key to the document room on the lower deck, Poirot said, where the codicil currently rests, inside a copy of the Thames navigation chart that no one would ordinarily open. I found it this morning. Thomas confirmed the key was taken from the hook outside the captain's quarters yesterday evening. Ashford looked at the key. His face had moved through several things: anger, calculation, and something that was finally, wearily, the expression of a man who has spent his last resource. "Constance," he said, turning to her. She looked at him as if she were looking at a stranger. "Constance, I think," she said, very quietly, "that you should stop." Chapter 11. The Architecture of Greed. Inspector Good formally arrested Gerald Ashford at 4:30 in the afternoon, in the upper saloon of the SS Celestine, with the Thames moving quietly past the windows in the manner of a thing entirely indifferent to human complications. Ashford did not resist. He sat for a long moment, looking at his own hands as if they belonged to someone he had recently been introduced to, and then he stood and went with the inspector with the contained resignation of a man who has been prepared, on some level, for exactly this outcome. What emerged over the following days, through the patient work of Inspector Good's team, the records of Ashford's firm, and the testimony of 3 additional witnesses who had not been aboard the Celestine, but whose evidence proved critical, was a picture both meticulous and familiar, the kind of crime that belongs not to passion or madness, but to the slow accumulation of ordinary human desires pressed against insufficient means. Gerald Ashford had been with the firm of Hartley and Marsh for 14 years, and for 11 of those years had managed the Bellingham account with a thoroughness that was professional in origin and eventually personal in character. He was, in the quiet way of competent solicitors, deeply embedded in Bellingham's affairs, the trust structures, the charitable foundation, the property arrangements, the succession planning. He had become, as such professionals sometimes do, not merely a servant of the estate, but something approaching its nervous system. He had also, over 7 of those 11 years, spent considerably beyond his means, not dramatically, not in the way of gambling debts or scandalous expenses, quietly. Subscriptions to things, a flat in a district he could not quite afford, travel undertaken with more frequency than his income strictly permitted, and a wardrobe of a quality that requires real money maintained over time. The gap between what Gerald Ashford earned and what Gerald Ashford spent was not enormous in any single year. Accumulated over 7, it was significant. He had filled this gap with a mechanism so subtle that it had taken 3 months of forensic accounting to fully unpick. Small, legitimate-seeming disbursements from estate administration accounts, coded to services and disbursements that had occurred but been double-billed, or to services that had not occurred at all. Not large amounts in any single instance. In aggregate, just over £42,000 over 7 years. Bellingham had discovered it, as Bellingham eventually discovered most things that required discovering, not through legal review or formal audit, but through the particular alertness of a man who had built a business by paying attention to numbers and had noticed, in reviewing a quarterly statement, that a figure for a specific legal disbursement in 1935 did not match his own memory of the transaction it purported to describe. He had said nothing initially. He had gone to his records, he had looked further, and then he had contacted a separate firm, not Hartley and Marsh, for a quiet review. The review had confirmed what he suspected. And Bellingham, who was not a vindictive man by nature, but was a thorough one, had determined to excise Gerald Ashford from his affairs so completely and finally that no trace of the damage could be attributed, by any future account, to mismanagement he had permitted to continue. He had of course told no one this directly, not Constance, not Edith Quarry even. What he had told Quarry was only that he wished to make a change, and that it was important. He had not told Ashford that he knew the full extent of the fraud. He had perhaps, this was Poirot's inference, and he stated it as such, not told Ashford anything directly at all, but had allowed the preparations for the codicil, the chartered boat, the assembled witnesses, to proceed until Ashford had assembled the picture himself and understood that the discovery was complete and irreversible. In that understanding, Gerald Ashford had made his decision. He had known, from his intimate knowledge of the estate, that monkshood grew in the Berkshire garden. He had known, from his quiet reading, what aconitine was, and what it did. He had known the Celestine and her layout from a previous journey 3 years prior, when he had accompanied Constance on a summer weekend aboard the vessel. He had known the habits of the crew and the position of the forward observation room, and the angle of the windows and the location of the small decanter table. He had planned it as he planned everything, methodically, in advance, without drama. The part he had not planned was Edith Quarry taking her glass, and the part he could not have anticipated was Hercule Poirot. Chapter 12. Miss Quarry's Quiet Truth. The afternoon following the arrest, Poirot sat with Edith Quarry on the lower deck, where a pair of deck chairs had been arranged and the sun, now uncomplicated by drama, made the river unreasonably beautiful. Edith Quarry had a cup of tea. Poirot had his second attempt at a tisane, which Thomas had improved upon with concentrated effort and now fell only slightly short of acceptable. "You knew," Poirot said. Edith Quarry looked at the river. "I suspected," she said. "There is a difference. Tell me what you suspected." "After I left him that evening, Arthur, I went back to my cabin and I thought about what he had said, about it being done, about needing it witnessed in the morning." She held the cup in both hands. "I thought about who else knew, about the people on board and what each of them stood to gain or lose. And I found myself thinking about Gerald." She paused, not because of any specific thing, more, the way he had been at dinner, watching Arthur, watching the way a man watches something he knows is about to be taken from him. "But you said nothing. To whom would I have said it? He was alive when I left him, and my suspicion was nothing but an impression, and I am, a secretary, a woman of middle age. In my experience, such impressions, offered to such investigators as Inspector Good, are received with polite insufficiency. You might have come to me. You had not yet arrived." Poirot acknowledged this with a small nod. "And when I did arrive," she considered, "I was frightened of being wrong, and I was frightened of something else." She looked at him directly. "The handkerchief. I knew it was there. I had dropped it when I stood to leave and I hadn't noticed. When you came to me about it, I knew it had been found, and I thought, if I point toward Gerald and I'm wrong, then I am a woman who dropped her handkerchief in a dead man's room and then accused his solicitor. The picture does not resolve well. So you chose to answer my questions honestly and allow the evidence to speak. I chose to trust," she said, "that someone of sufficient intelligence would find the right end of the thread." She looked at him with something that was not quite a smile, but was its functional equivalent. "I was correct." Poirot was quiet for a moment. "You were very fond of him," he said. Not the way he had said it to Constance. That had been a question. This was something else. Edith Quarry set down her cup. "He was the most difficult man I ever worked for," she said, "and the most honest, and the loneliest." She looked at the river again. "He made good decisions and dreadful ones. In equal measure, he was capable of great generosity and great stubbornness. He read everything he could get his hands on, and never admitted he enjoyed it." She stopped. "I knew his habits and his fears and the particular sound his footstep made on any surface, and the precise way he took his tea, and he knew that I knew all of these things, and it was a kind of partnership. That word is too businesslike. A kind of fluency," Poirot said. She looked at him with surprise. "Yes," she said, "fluency, exactly that." They sat for a while in the afternoon sun, listening to the river. "One question more," Poirot said at last. "The codicil he showed you. You said you saw it but did not read it in detail. Did you form any impression of its contents beyond the removal of Crane?" Edith Quarry was quiet for a long moment. "There was a second change," she said carefully. "I saw the name of the foundation appeared more than once, and below it, in his handwriting, he had very particular handwriting, very upright, very clear, a name I recognized. A name I wasn't expecting to see in that context." "Whose name?" She met his eyes. "Mine," she said quietly. "He was leaving the foundation to my direction. in entirety, with full authority. She looked away. I think that is why he wanted me there. Not just to witness. He wanted me to see it. He wanted me to know. The river moved past them, patient and silver, carrying everything and revealing nothing. Chapter 13. What Poirot Sees When He Closes His Eyes. That evening, Poirot sat alone in the upper saloon as the sun went down behind the willows and the river turned from silver to pewter to the deep, quiet grey of gathered dusk. He had declined dinner, asking only for bread, butter, and the small pot of mustard he had noted in the galley stores. English mustard, which he did not prefer, but which was present, which was the important thing. He ate slowly and thought. The case was closed in the legal sense. Ashford was in custody. The poison was confirmed. The codicil had been retrieved and photographed, and its contents entered into the record. Constance Bellingham would inherit under the existing will. Sylvester Crane would face his own separate reckoning for the business irregularities. A civil matter now, not a criminal one, but not inconsequential. Edith Quarry would find, when the estate was eventually settled, that the unsigned codicil's intentions were, if not legally binding, at least morally clear enough that a good solicitor, a better solicitor than Gerald Ashford, might find some mechanism for honouring them. But cases, Poirot knew, are never truly closed. They are only contained. What remained, what always remained, was the human material. The living people who had stood in proximity to violent death and would carry that proximity always. A slight change in temperature they could not always account for. He thought of Constance Bellingham, who had stood at a dark window and watched her uncle die. She had told him this in the aftermath of the arrest, quietly, without drama. She had seen the glass fall and understood, in that wordless way the mind sometimes perceives what it cannot yet process, that something had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had fled in panic. She would regret the fleeing for a very long time, Poirot suspected, not because her presence could have changed anything, but because the human heart is ungenerous in these matters and rarely makes the distinction between consequence and comfort. He thought of Sylvester Crane, who had gone to a man he had wronged and offered what amounted to a deathbed apology in advance, only to be turned away. There was no comfort in having been honest in that final encounter. It had not saved Bellingham, and it had not saved Crane from his own reckoning. But it was noted. Poirot had noted it. Crane was a man who had made bad decisions in the belief that good decisions would follow, a very common configuration, and not entirely without sympathy. He thought of Dr. Harriet Voss, who had saved the case, really, not dramatically, not deliberately, but through the simple integrity of being exactly what she claimed to be, a physician of precision and conscience, who smelled what she smelled and said what she concluded, and left the rest to others. In 11 years of attending Arthur Bellingham, she had done what good doctors do. She had been present, watchful, and honest. In his death, she had done it one final time. He thought of Thomas Wick, who had walked into a dark room with a rattling porthole in his mind, and had come out with something no man of 23 should have to carry. He had been impeccable throughout. He would, Poirot thought, be an excellent head steward in time. And he thought of Edith Quarry, holding her teacup in both hands in the afternoon light, describing fluency. He thought that Arthur Bellingham had been, as she said, the loneliest of men, and that the loneliest men sometimes conduct their most important communications through the medium of formal documents witnessed under law, which is a very particular English kind of eloquence. He thought of Gerald Ashford, of a man who had spent 14 years handling other people's wealth and had allowed the proximity of it to alter his understanding of his own needs. It was not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden corruption. It was the gradual warming of a frog in water, the kind of self-adjustment that happens so incrementally that one never notes the moment at which ordinary aspiration became ordinary theft. And then, when discovery loomed, the escalation from theft to something that would have been unimaginable to the young man 14 years ago. This too was a common configuration, not without sympathy, but not therefore without responsibility. The little grey cells, Poirot thought, are not engaged only in the finding of facts. They are engaged, more often than any gallery cares to see, in the contemplation of how a person arrives at the worst version of themselves. This is not a comfortable contemplation. It is, however, a necessary one, because only by understanding the mechanism can one recognize it early enough to interrupt it. He finished the bread and butter. He thought briefly of his flat in London and the regularity of its geometry, and the shelf of his detective novels in precise alphabetical order, and the view from the window over a street whose patterns he had memorized entirely. He thought of it with genuine warmth, the way a man thinks of home. Outside, the river moved in the dark, carrying everything southward, patient as water always is. Chapter 14. The Departure at Culverham Pier. The SS Celestine was cleared for departure at 10 o'clock the following morning. She did not continue her journey to Oxford. There seemed, by common and unspoken agreement, no appetite for that. Captain Frew charted instead the return course to London, and the vessel moved with quiet purpose downriver through the morning, the banks on either side releasing themselves from mist as the sun established itself with autumnal determination. The passengers, reduced now to 4, Constance, Crane, Voss and Quarry, occupied themselves in various ways that amounted to the same thing: the careful management of proximity under circumstances that had stripped all social convenience away and left only the bare, exposed fact of what they had all been through together. Crane sat on the lower deck with a pot of coffee and a newspaper that he did not read. He had slept badly, and it showed, but there was something in his face that was different from the night before, not precisely relieved, but as if a particular suspended weight had descended. The worst had happened, and he had survived its happening, which is sometimes its own form of strange comfort. Dr. Voss sat in the upper saloon with a medical journal, and read it with genuine attention. She was, Poirot thought, perhaps the most self-contained person he had encountered in recent years, a woman who had long since made her accommodation with the solitary nature of intelligence, and had found it, if not always companionable, at least adequate. Constance Bellingham stood at the stern rail for much of the journey, watching the river they had already travelled recede behind them. She stood with the still, inward quality of someone doing serious internal work, the kind that cannot be hurried and does not benefit from company. When Poirot passed near her at one point, she turned and looked at him, and he saw in her face something that was not grief exactly, but was in the family of grief, the particular weight of having loved someone imperfectly and now having no further opportunity to do otherwise. He was going to leave the foundation to Edith, she said. Yes, Poirot said. That was right of him. She looked back at the water. I would have fought it, I think, before. Now, no. She knows it better than I do. She has known it from the beginning. It was always more hers than mine. A pause. I think he knew that too, but it took him 17 years to say it. Some men require time, Poirot said, to arrive at what they already know. She almost smiled. And some women. He left her to the river. Edith Quarry found him before they docked. She came to where he sat in the lower saloon with his untouched cup of something approximately related to a tisane, and she stood rather than sat, which was characteristic. I want to thank you, she said, not on behalf of the investigation or the facts of the case, for listening, for following the thread where it led rather than where it was convenient. It is the only way worth doing it, Poirot said. Nevertheless, she was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about what happens now, about the foundation, and whether Arthur's intentions can be formalized in some way. I know they cannot be, legally, but I wonder whether Constance, Mademoiselle Constance, Poirot said, is not her uncle. She is, if I am not mistaken, a good deal more straightforward. I think you will find, if you approach her directly and soon, that she shares her uncle's view of your capacity without his difficulty in expressing it. Edith Quarry absorbed this. "Yes," she said finally, "I think you may be right." She returned to her seat. Poirot watched the south bank emerge from mist, and the first smoke and stone of the city beginning to assemble on the horizon. Inspector Good met them at the London pier. He shook Poirot's hand with the slightly awkward warmth of a man who is grateful and constitutionally uncomfortable expressing it. "Couldn't have untangled it without you," he said. "You would have arrived there," Poirot said, with the magnanimity of a man quite certain of his own role. "Perhaps slightly more slowly," he smiled. "The evidence was all present. It required only the correct arrangement. The glass. That was the thing that did it, wasn't it? The second glass. The second glass was the answer to the wrong question," Poirot said. "The killer placed it to suggest a companion, to implicate Miss Quarry. But Miss Quarry had taken her glass when she left. So the second glass, rather than implicating her, revealed the killer. An action intended to conceal became an action that exposed." He tilted his head. "This is very often how it goes. The criminal makes one small error of information, one fact they do not know, and it reverses every calculation. Mr. Ashford did not know that Miss Quarry always takes her glass." "How did you know that she did?" "I did not," Poirot admitted. "I asked Thomas. He told me she did it every evening. It was a personal habit of hers, a small fastidiousness about not leaving glassware. Once I knew that, the second glass became inexplicable on any innocent interpretation." Good nodded slowly. "Neat," he said. "Crime," said Poirot, picking up his hat, "is rarely neat. It only appears so when properly understood." He stepped off the gangplank onto the pier and stood for a moment looking back at the SS Celestine, who sat in the water with her brass fittings gleaming and her mahogany panels warm in the mid-morning light, as dignified as a dowager who has witnessed a great deal and intends to witness a great deal more. A vessel of certain age and earned character. The river moved past her, indifferent and continuous. Somewhere upstream was the country that had generated all this, the house and its garden with the monkshood growing in the border, the office with its quietly falsified records, the life that had moved, slowly and with great regularity, from ordinary ambition towards something that could not be forgiven. And somewhere in the records of a London solicitor's firm, eventually would be a document that attempted to say what Arthur Bellingham had failed, across 17 years, to say in words, that there was a woman who had been present at the centre of his life and had not been thanked for it, and that he had, in the end, found a way to correct this, which was something, even if it was not everything. Poirot put on his hat. He straightened his moustache with 2 fingers, a ritual of restoration. He turned from the river and walked toward the waiting motor car, his small patent leather shoes making their precise sound on the stones of the pier. The case was concluded. The little grey cells, having done their work, returned to their customary watchful rest. The river continued in its ancient business. It always did.